The night my mother and stepfather threw me out of the house. It was snowing so hard the streetlights looked like they were drowning in white. I remember standing on the porch with nothing but a thin coat, my phone, and a few dollars in my pocket while Joseph pointed toward the street like I was some kind of stranger who had accidentally wandered into the wrong house. "Go," he said coldly. "You're 23. It's time you learn how the real world works." My mother didn't stop him. Rebecca stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. Watching me like this was some necessary lesson she had finally decided to enforce. "You can't live off us forever. Amanda," she said, "it's time you grow up." The snow crunched under my shoes as I stepped off the porch. Behind me, the door slammed shut. For a long moment I stood there staring at the house I had grown up in, trying to understand how everything had collapsed so quickly. Just an hour earlier we had been sitting around the dining table, pretending to celebrate Christmas. Now I was standing alone in the freezing dark. I didn't know it then, but that night, when they threw me out believing I had nothing, would lead me to something neither of them ever imagined. And by the time the truth surfaced, the entire balance of power in our family would be completely different. Earlier that evening, the house had smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon candles, the kind of warm holiday atmosphere that usually made everything feel safe. Joseph had been carving the turkey while Rebecca arranged plates around the table. Christmas lights glowed in the windows, reflecting softly against the snow outside. For a few minutes, everything felt normal, but Joseph had been watching me all evening. Not casually, critically. He had that look he sometimes wore when he was silently evaluating something he didn't approve of. I should have known what was coming. "So," Joseph said suddenly as he set down the knife, "any progress on that job search?" The question hung in the air. I forced a small smile. "I've had a couple interviews," I said carefully. "I'm waiting to hear back." Joseph leaned back in his chair. "A couple interviews," he repeated slowly. Rebecca didn't say anything. She just continued pouring wine into the glasses like she was waiting for the conversation to unfold. Joseph's voice grew sharper. "You graduated 6 months ago. Amanda, most people would have figured something out by now." My stomach tightened. "I am figuring it out," I said quietly. Joseph shook his head. "No, you're not." The room suddenly felt colder, even with the heat running. "You're living here," he continued, gesturing around the house, "eating our food, using our electricity, and you still don't have a real plan." "That's not fair," I said. But the moment the words left my mouth, I knew the argument had already begun. Joseph's eyes hardened. "Fair?" he said. "You think the real world is fair?" Rebecca finally spoke. "Amanda," she said calmly, "your stepfather is right about one thing. You can't stay dependent forever." Dependent. The word hit harder than anything Joseph had said. "I'm not dependent," I said. Joseph laughed under his breath. "You don't have a job." "I'm trying." "You're comfortable," he corrected. Rebecca sighed softly, like she had already decided how this conversation would end. "You're 23, she said. "It's time to start taking responsibility." I felt heat rising in my chest. "Responsibility," I said. "I just graduated. It's not like I've been doing nothing." Joseph pushed his chair back slightly. "That's exactly what it feels like." The tension at the table had completely replaced the holiday warmth. Even the Christmas lights suddenly looked harsh instead of cozy. "I'm not asking for much," Joseph continued. "Just some effort." "I am making an effort." Joseph leaned forward. "No. Amanda, effort is waking up every day knowing no one is going to rescue you." Rebecca nodded quietly beside him. "And maybe," she added, "it's time you learn that." For a moment I just stared at both of them, waiting for one of them to soften, waiting for my mother to defend me. She didn't. Joseph suddenly stood up from the table. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You know what?" he said. "Maybe the best thing for you is to figure things out on your own." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Joseph walked toward the front door and pulled it open. Cold wind rushed inside the house. "It means," he said, pointing outside. "You're leaving." I thought he was joking, but his face was completely serious. "You can't be serious," I said. Rebecca stood slowly from her chair. Her expression was firm. "Maybe some independence will help you grow," she said. The room spun slightly as I tried to process what they were saying. "You're kicking me out?" I asked. Joseph shrugged. "You're an adult." "But it's Christmas. All the more reason to start a new chapter," he replied. My voice cracked. "At least let me pack some things." Joseph shook his head immediately. "No." Rebecca didn't argue. Instead, she walked toward the door and held it open. "You'll figure something out," she said. The finality in her voice hurt more than the cold air pouring into the house. I grabbed my coat from the chair and stepped toward the doorway. Snow was already covering the porch. Joseph stood beside the door, waiting impatiently. I paused for one last moment, hoping someone would stop this. No one did. So I stepped outside. The door slammed shut behind me. And just like that, I was alone in the freezing night, with nowhere to go. At the time, I believed they had taken everything from me. I had no home, no job, no future plan. What I didn't realize was that somewhere in my bag was an old bank card my grandmother had given me years earlier. A card I had never used. A card that would soon change everything. The snow kept falling long after the door slammed behind me. For a while, I just stood there on the sidewalk, staring at the house like it might suddenly open again. Like my mother might come outside and tell me it had all been a terrible overreaction. But the lights in the windows didn't move. The curtains stayed closed. And the house that had always been my home suddenly felt like a place I had never belonged to at all. Cold air burned against my face as I pulled my coat tighter around me. It wasn't a winter coat, just a light one I had grabbed from the chair when Joseph pointed at the door. My breath formed pale clouds in the dark. I checked my phone. 3% battery. Of course. For a moment, panic started to rise in my chest. I had no place to go. No bag. No money except the few dollars in my pocket. The street was almost empty. Christmas Eve had pushed most people indoors with their families. Families. I laughed quietly to myself. The sound disappearing into the snow. After a few minutes of standing there, the cold finally forced me to move. I started walking. I didn't really have a destination. I just knew that standing outside that house any longer would make me feel even worse. The town looked strangely peaceful under the snowfall. Streetlights glowed softly through the white haze, and the quiet roads made every step echo more than usual. My shoes were already getting wet. I shoved my hands deeper into my pockets and kept walking. Joseph's voice replayed in my head. "You're 23. It's time you learn how the real world works." Maybe he thought he was teaching me something. Or maybe he just wanted me gone. The more I replayed the dinner conversation in my mind, the more something about it felt strange. Joseph hadn't just been frustrated. He had seemed impatient, like he had been waiting for that argument. I shook the thought away. Right now, I needed warmth more than answers. A few blocks away, I spotted a small cafe with its lights still on. A sign in the window read, "Open 24 hours." Relief rushed through me. When I pushed open the door, a wave of heat wrapped around me instantly. The cafe was almost empty. Only one other person sat near the window with a laptop. The smell of coffee and baked bread filled the air. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the warmth soak back into my hands. The woman behind the counter looked up. "Rough night?" she asked gently. I managed a small smile. You could say that. I ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a small coffee, and paid with the last of the cash in my pocket. The warm cup between my hands felt like a lifeline. I chose a seat in the corner and sank into the chair, finally allowing my body to relax for the first time since leaving the house. Outside, the snow continued to fall steadily. For a while, I just watched the street. My mind kept drifting back to my mother. Rebecca hadn't even tried to stop Joseph. That hurt more than anything else. Growing up, my grandmother had always said Rebecca and I were too similar, too stubborn, too independent. But tonight, it felt like she had chosen Joseph's side without hesitation. Maybe she had always been on his side. I took a slow sip of coffee and tried to push the thoughts away. There was no point thinking about it now. What mattered was what I was going to do next. My phone battery dropped to 2%. Great. I switched it to low power mode and slipped it back into my pocket. For a moment, my eyes closed from exhaustion. I hadn't realized how tired I was. The past few months of job searching had already drained most of my confidence. Rejection emails. Polite interviews that never led anywhere. Constant reminders that experience mattered more than potential. Now I didn't even have a place to sleep. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. What now? That question circled in my head again and again. I didn't have many options. Friends were visiting their families for the holidays. Hotels in town were expensive, and my wallet was empty. The idea of sleeping in the cafe crossed my mind, but I doubted they would let someone stay all night without buying anything. My fingers tapped slowly against the table. That was when a small memory surfaced. Something I hadn't thought about in years. My grandmother's voice. "You may need this one day." I frowned slightly as the memory sharpened. A bank card. Years ago. Not long before she passed away. My grandmother had handed me a small envelope. Inside was an old debit card with my name written on the back in her handwriting. I remembered asking her what it was for. She had only smiled. "Just keep it safe," she said. "You'll understand when the time comes." At the time, I assumed it was just a small savings account she had opened for me. I had never used it. Honestly, I had almost forgotten about it completely. Until now. My bag wasn't with me tonight. But the card was... I always kept it tucked inside the small wallet pocket of my coat. Slowly, I reached into the inner lining of my coat. My fingers brushed against the thin plastic. I pulled the card out and stared at it. It looked ordinary. Just a simple bank card with a faded logo and a chip on the front. I had no idea how much money was in the account. Maybe a few $100s. Maybe less. But right now, even $50 would feel like a miracle. I turned the card over in my hands thoughtfully. The name of a bank branch was printed near the bottom. A branch located only a few blocks away. I glanced toward the cafe window. Morning would come in a few hours. And for the first time since being thrown out into the snow, a small sense of possibility appeared. If there was money in this account, even a little, it might give me enough time to figure out my next move. I slipped the card back into my pocket and leaned back in the chair. Tomorrow morning I would go to the bank and check what my grandmother had left me. At that moment, I believed I was just hoping for enough money to survive a few days. I had no idea that walking into that bank the next morning would change my entire life. Morning arrived slowly. The sky outside the cafe window shifted from dark gray to a pale winter blue, and the snow that had fallen through the night covered the streets in a quiet white blanket. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the moment Joseph opened the door and pointed outside. "Go!" The words still echoed in my head. By the time the sun finally rose above the rooftops, the cafe had begun filling with early customers. A few people came in for coffee on their way to work, stamping snow off their boots and shaking the cold from their coats. The world had already moved on from Christmas night, but my life still felt frozen somewhere between yesterday and whatever came next. I wrapped my hands around the empty coffee cup and checked my phone. 1% battery. Perfect timing. I slipped it back into my pocket and stood up. My legs felt stiff from sitting in the same chair all night, but the movement helped wake me up. Outside, the air was still cold enough to sting my cheeks. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the snow-covered sidewalk. The bank branch printed on the card was only a few blocks away. I had walked past it countless times before, never imagining that one day I would be standing outside its doors with nowhere else to go. The building looked calm and ordinary in the morning light. Glass doors, clean stone walls, and a sign above the entrance displaying the bank's name. Inside, warm lights glowed through the windows. For a moment, I hesitated on the sidewalk. My fingers tightened around the card inside my coat pocket. This felt strangely important. Not because I expected anything life-changing to happen, but because this small piece of plastic represented the only safety net I had left. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warmth hit me immediately. The interior of the bank was quiet and orderly. A few customers stood in line near the teller counters, and soft instrumental music played faintly through the speakers. It felt like a completely different world from the cold street outside. I joined the short line and waited. While I stood there, I noticed how out of place I must have looked. My coat was wrinkled, my hair messy from a sleepless night, and my eyes still heavy with exhaustion. Everyone else looked prepared for a normal workday. I looked like someone who had spent the night trying not to fall apart. When my turn finally came, the teller behind the counter greeted me politely. "Good morning. How can I help you?" I pulled the card from my pocket and slid it across the counter. "Hi," I said quietly. "I just wanted to check the balance on this account." The teller smiled politely and picked up the card. "Of course." She turned toward her computer and inserted the card into the reader. For a moment, everything seemed completely normal. She typed a few commands into the system, glancing briefly at the screen. Then something changed. Her fingers stopped moving. Her expression shifted slightly. At first, I thought I had imagined it. But then she leaned closer to the monitor, reading something carefully. Her smile disappeared. A small line formed between her eyebrows. "Is everything okay?" I asked. The teller looked up at me quickly. "Yes. One moment, please." Her tone had changed. It wasn't rude. But it definitely wasn't casual anymore either. She turned back to the computer and typed again, her movements suddenly slower and more deliberate. I noticed her eyes scanning the screen several times. Then she reached for the phone beside her desk. My stomach tightened. "Hi," she said quietly into the receiver. "Could you come to the front for a moment?" She paused. "Yes. I think you should see this." My mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. Maybe the account had been closed years ago. Maybe there was some kind of legal issue attached to it. Maybe the card didn't belong to me at all. I swallowed nervously. "Did I do something wrong?" I asked. The teller shook her head quickly. "No, not at all." But she didn't sound very convincing. A minute later, a man in a dark suit approached from a hallway behind the counters. He looked like he might be the branch manager. The teller turned her monitor slightly so he could see it. He leaned down and studied the screen. At first, his expression was neutral. Then his eyes widened slightly. He straightened up and looked at me. Then back at the screen. Then at me again. The silence between the three of us stretched awkwardly. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Miss," he said carefully, "could you please come with me for a moment?" My heart skipped. "Is there a problem with the account?" I asked. The manager shook his head slowly. "No problem," he said. But his voice sounded tense. "I just need to verify a few details." He gestured toward a door leading to a small office near the back of the bank. I followed him through the lobby, feeling the curious eyes of a few customers watching as we walked past. Inside the office, he motioned for me to sit down. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of computers somewhere nearby. The manager sat across from me and placed the card carefully on the desk between us. He studied it for a moment like it was something fragile. Then he looked at me again. "Can you confirm where you received this card?" he asked. "My grandmother gave it to me," I said. "Years ago." He nodded slowly. "And her name?" I told him. The moment the name left my mouth, something in his expression changed again. He turned back toward his computer and opened a file on the screen. The glow of the monitor reflected faintly in his glasses as he read. A few seconds later, he leaned back in his chair and took a slow breath. Then he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite understand. Surprise. Maybe even disbelief. He reached for the phone on his desk. "I think," he said quietly, "we may need to call someone else down here." "Who?" I asked. He hesitated for a second before answering. "The chairman of the bank." My stomach dropped. Because I had only come in hoping the account might contain a few $100s. And suddenly, the head of the entire bank was about to get involved. I thought I had misheard him. "The chairman of the bank," I repeated slowly. The branch manager nodded once, his expression still tense as he placed the phone back onto the desk. "Yes." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The words hung in the quiet office like something unreal. I had come here expecting maybe a few $100s in a forgotten account. Enough to pay for a cheap motel room or maybe buy myself a few days to figure out where my life was going. Now the manager was saying the chairman of the entire bank needed to come down and speak with me. My mind raced through every possible explanation. Maybe the card had been reported stolen years ago. Maybe there was some kind of legal issue attached to the account. Maybe my grandmother had accidentally connected my name to something complicated that now needed clarification. The manager seemed to notice the worry in my face. "Don't be alarmed," he said quickly. "This is simply a verification matter." But his tone didn't sound casual at all. It sounded careful, almost cautious. I shifted slightly in the chair, trying to steady the nervous energy building inside me. "How long will that take?" I asked. "He's already in the building," the manager replied. That didn't help my nerves. The silence returned. Outside the office window, I could see the bank lobby. Customers moved between the counters, unaware that something unusual was happening just a few feet away. The normal rhythm of the bank continued. But inside this office, the air felt thick with tension. I looked down at the card lying on the desk. It looked so ordinary. Just a small plastic card with a faded logo and my name written on the back in my grandmother's handwriting. I remembered the day she gave it to me. We had been sitting at her kitchen table, drinking tea while the afternoon sunlight streamed through the curtains. She had slid the envelope across the table toward me. "Keep this safe," she said. I had laughed softly.
What is it?
"Something for later." I opened the envelope and saw the card. A bank card. She smiled in that quiet, mysterious way she sometimes had. "You may need it one day." I had assumed it was a small savings account. Maybe money she had set aside for emergencies. I never imagined it would lead to this. My thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the office door. The manager stood immediately. "Come in," he said. The door opened slowly. A tall man stepped inside the room. He looked to be in his late 50s, with silver hair neatly combed back and a dark suit that looked expensive even to someone like me who knew nothing about fashion. The moment he entered, the atmosphere in the room changed. There was something about the way he carried himself. Calm, controlled. The kind of presence that made people instinctively pay attention. The manager straightened his posture instantly. "Mr. Brandon," he said respectfully. The man nodded slightly before his eyes turned toward me. For a second he studied my face. Then his gaze moved to the card on the desk. "Is this the account?" he asked quietly. "Yes," the manager replied. Brandon stepped closer to the desk. Up close, I noticed the lines around his eyes and the serious concentration in his expression. He picked up the card carefully between his fingers. For a moment, he simply looked at it. Then he turned it over. His eyes moved slowly across the surface like he was confirming something. I felt strangely nervous under his silence. Finally, he spoke. "Where did you get this?" "My grandmother gave it to me," I said. His eyes lifted immediately. "What was her name?" I told him. The reaction was instant. Brandon's expression shifted from curiosity to something much sharper. Recognition. He glanced briefly at the manager, then back at me. "Please confirm again," he said. I repeated the name. Brandon inhaled slowly and looked down at the card again. For the first time since entering the room, he seemed genuinely surprised. The manager leaned closer to the computer screen. "Sir." The system flagged the account the moment the card was entered. Brandon nodded slightly. "I can see that." He placed the card back onto the desk and sat down in the chair across from me. For several seconds he didn't say anything. He simply looked at me as though trying to understand something. Finally he turned toward the manager. "Would you give us a moment?" The manager blinked. "Of course." He stood up immediately and left the office, closing the door quietly behind him. Now the room felt even quieter. Just the two of us. Brandon leaned slightly forward, resting his hands on the desk. "Miss Amanda," he said calmly, "I'm going to ask you a few questions." I nodded. "Have you ever used this card before today?" "No." "Did your grandmother ever explain what it was connected to?" I shook my head. "She just told me to keep it." Brandon studied my face for a moment. Then he turned the computer monitor slightly so he could see it better. His eyes scanned the information on the screen. The silence stretched again. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Finally, Brandon leaned back in his chair. His expression had changed completely now. The surprise was still there, but something else had joined it. "Respect. Miss Amanda," he said quietly. "I believe there is something about your grandmother you may not have known." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering immediately, Brandon turned the computer monitor toward me. Numbers and documents filled the screen. Account files, legal records, investment statements. None of it made sense at first glance. Brandon folded his hands together. "You came here today thinking this was a normal bank account." I nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." He looked at the screen again, then back at me. "I'm afraid it's something very different." A strange feeling began forming in my chest. "What kind of account is it?" I asked. Brandon paused for a moment before answering. "It's a private trust." The word meant almost nothing to me. I stared at him, waiting for an explanation. Brandon turned slightly in his chair and pointed toward the screen. "You see," he said calmly, "this card is not connected to a personal savings account." My confusion deepened. "Then what is it connected to?" Brandon's voice became quieter. "To something your grandmother built many years ago." He tapped a key on the keyboard. More files appeared on the screen, and as he began opening them one by one, I had the growing feeling that the life I thought I understood was about to change completely. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen without understanding what I was looking at. Lines of numbers filled the monitor. Charts, account codes, and documents stacked across the page like pieces of a puzzle that didn't belong to me. "This doesn't look like a normal account," I said quietly. Brandon gave a small nod. "That's because it isn't." He moved the mouse slowly and opened another file. A new page appeared, showing columns of investments and financial summaries that stretched far longer than any personal bank statement I had ever seen. I leaned forward slightly in my chair. "I think there's been a mistake," I said. "My grandmother wasn't rich. At least, that was what I had always believed. She had lived in a small house on the edge of town. She drove an old car. She wore simple clothes and spent most of her afternoons reading in her garden. Nothing about her life suggested wealth." Brandon studied me carefully before answering. "Sometimes," he said calmly, "people with the most financial discipline are also the most private about it." He clicked another file open. More documents appeared. This time the headings made a little more sense. Real estate holdings, corporate shares, investment portfolios. My eyes moved slowly across the numbers. The values looked far larger than anything I had ever imagined being connected to my family. "Wait," I said softly. "What is all this?" Brandon folded his hands on the desk. "This is the trust your grandmother established." The word trust echoed strangely in my head. "I don't understand." He nodded, as if he expected that reaction. "A trust is a legal financial structure," he explained. "It allows assets to be managed and protected for a specific person or group of people." I looked back at the screen. "So this trust belongs to my grandmother." Brandon hesitated slightly before answering. "It did." The room suddenly felt very quiet. "And now?" I asked. Brandon pointed gently toward one section of the screen. I followed his finger. Near the center of the document was a line labeled Primary Beneficiary. Underneath it was my name. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. "That can't be right," I whispered. Brandon leaned back in his chair. "It is," I shook my head slowly. "My grandmother never told me about any of this. That was intentional." I looked at him again. "What do you mean?" Brandon turned the screen back toward himself and opened another document. "This trust was created under very specific conditions," he said. A long legal document filled the monitor. I recognized some words. Beneficiary. Activation clause. Verification requirement. Brandon scrolled down until he reached a highlighted section. Your grandmother included a condition that the trust could only become active when you personally came to this bank and presented the card. My mind spun. So, if I never used the card, the trust would have remained inactive. He finished. I sat back in the chair. trying to absorb everything he was saying. My grandmother had built a trust. She had hidden it from the family, and she had designed it so that only I could activate it. Why? I asked quietly. Brandon looked at me for a moment before answering. Your grandmother was a very careful woman. That was true. She had always been thoughtful, patient, and observant. But this felt like something much bigger than simple caution. Brandon continued scrolling through the records. You see, he said, this trust isn't just a savings account. I watched as more financial reports appeared. Investment funds, real estate development shares, private capital projects. Each file seemed connected to something larger. The more I looked at the screen, the more overwhelming it felt. I don't understand how my grandmother could have been involved in all this, I said. Brandon leaned forward slightly. Years ago, he explained. Your grandmother was one of the early investors in several property development projects financed by this bank. That surprised me. My grandmother. He nodded. She invested small amounts initially, but those investments grew significantly over time. He opened another document. The numbers displayed on the page were enormous, even without understanding the full details. I could tell these investments had expanded for years. Instead of withdrawing the profits, my grandmother had apparently reinvested them again and again, building something far larger than I ever realized. She never talked about any of this, I said. Brandon's voice remained calm. Some people prefer to keep their financial decisions private. I stared at the monitor again. My grandmother had spent her life quietly building something enormous, and no one in the family knew. Or at least, I thought no one knew. Brandon continued reading through the documents. Then he paused. His eyes focused on something on the screen. He leaned slightly closer to the computer. For several seconds he didn't speak. I noticed the change in his expression. What is it? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened another file connected to the trust's legal structure. The screen filled with more information. Family protection clauses, inheritance conditions, restrictions. Finally, Brandon leaned back again. There's something else you should know, he said slowly. My stomach tightened. What? He turned the monitor slightly so I could see a new document. This trust was designed with a series of safeguards. Safeguards. Yes. I read the heading at the top of the page. Protective trust conditions. Brandon folded his hands together again. Your grandmother wanted to make sure this inheritance remained under your control. That sounded comforting. But the next words out of his mouth changed everything. She was particularly concerned about potential pressure from certain family members. I blinked. Family members. Brandon nodded once. She believed that if the existence of the trust became widely known too early, it might create complications. My mind immediately jumped to one person. Rebecca, my mother, and Joseph. The memory of last night flashed through my head again. Joseph shouting, Rebecca standing silently beside him. You'll never survive on your own. I looked back at Brandon. Did my grandmother say who she was worried about? Brandon hesitated slightly. Then he turned back toward the screen and opened another file. A note appeared in the system. His expression changed again, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. There may be more history behind this trust than you realize. I stared at Brandon, waiting for him to continue. There may be more history behind this trust than you realize. The words sat in the air between us like a warning. What kind of history? I asked quietly. Brandon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back to the computer and opened another file connected to the trust documents. The screen filled with pages of legal notes and meeting records. These are internal records, he explained. Notes taken when the trust was first established. I leaned forward slightly. Established when? Nearly 15 years ago. 15 years. That meant my grandmother created this long before I graduated college. Long before Joseph even came into our lives. Brandon scrolled through several pages slowly. These documents show discussions between your grandmother and the bank's legal department, he said. What kind of discussions? Mostly about protecting the structure of the trust. I frowned. Protecting it from what? Brandon hesitated before answering. From family influence. The phrase made my chest tighten. What does that mean? He opened another document and pointed to a paragraph. This section explains why your grandmother insisted on strict activation rules. I read the lines carefully. The legal language was complicated, but one idea stood out clearly. The trust could not be accessed by anyone except me. Not by a parent. Not by a guardian. Not even by a lawyer acting on my behalf. Only me. In person. With the card. I looked up from the screen. So she didn't want anyone else touching it. Brandon nodded. That was very clear. But why? He leaned back slightly in his chair. That's where things become more complicated. My stomach tightened again. Brandon opened another file labeled Family Communication Notes. Inside were records from several conversations between my grandmother and bank advisors. He scrolled until he reached a particular entry. This meeting took place about 12 years ago, he said. I leaned closer. The note summarized a conversation about inheritance disclosure. According to the record, the bank had suggested informing certain family members about the trust structure in case something happened to my grandmother. She had refused. Firmly. Instead, she insisted the trust remained completely confidential until I activated it myself. I felt a strange chill run through me. She didn't want my family to know, I said slowly. Correct? Did she explain why? Brandon nodded once. Yes. He scrolled a little further. Then he turned the monitor toward me. I read the note carefully. Concern about financial pressure from relatives. Concern about influence over beneficiary. Concern about possible attempts to redirect inheritance. My hands tightened slightly in my lap. She thought someone might try to take the money from me. That appears to be the concern, Brandon replied. For a moment I didn't say anything. Images from the past drifted through my mind. Small moments that had never seemed important before. Rebecca asking questions about my grandmother's will after she passed away. Joseph once casually asking whether my grandmother had left me anything valuable. At the time I thought it was just curiosity. Now it felt different. How many people in my family knew about this? I asked. Brandon considered the question carefully. Officially. None. Officially. He nodded. However, there is something else you should see. He opened another document from the archive. The date immediately caught my attention. 3 years ago. This is a record of a phone call received by the bank. Brandon explained. From who? He pointed to the name listed in the file. Rebecca. My mother. My heart skipped. She called the bank. I asked. Yes. What did she want? Brandon read from the summary. She asked whether any accounts had been established in your name by your grandmother. My mind raced. And we declined to provide any information. Because of the confidentiality clause. Exactly. The room suddenly felt smaller. So my mother suspected something, I said. It appears that way. I tried to process what that meant. 3 years ago, Rebecca had already been asking about money connected to my grandmother. But she had never said a word to me. Not once. I thought back to the months before my grandmother passed away. Rebecca had visited her several times. They had long private conversations in the kitchen while I sat in the living room watching television. At the time, I assumed they were just talking about family matters. Now I wondered what those conversations had really been about. Did my grandmother know my mother asked about the accounts? I asked. Brandon nodded. Yes. And she did not change the structure of the trust. That meant something important. Even after knowing my mother was searching for the money, my grandmother still chose to leave everything the same. Still chose to protect it. For me, I looked back at the screen again. My name still sat there under primary beneficiary. Everything in this complicated financial system had been built for one purpose: to make sure the inheritance reached me, not anyone else. Brandon continued scrolling through the files. Then he stopped again. This is interesting, he murmured. What? He opened another record. This one is more recent. I leaned forward again. The date was from just a few weeks earlier. What is it? I asked. Brandon studied the file carefully before answering. It's another inquiry about the trust. My chest tightened again. From my mother? No. He turned the screen slightly so I could see the name listed in the request. The letters stared back at me like a punch to the stomach. Joseph. My stepfather. I blinked. Joseph contacted the bank. Yes. When? 2 weeks ago. That meant something else entirely. The night Joseph threw me out of the house suddenly felt different. Less like an argument. More like something planned. What did he ask? I said quietly. Brandon read from the report. He didn't ask directly about the trust. Instead, he asked whether any legacy accounts connected to your name had recently been activated. A cold feeling settled deep in my chest. Joseph didn't know the details, but he suspected something existed, and the timing was impossible to ignore. 2 weeks ago, he started asking questions. Last night, he threw me out of the house. I leaned back slowly in my chair. My mind replayed Joseph's words again. You'll never survive on your own. Maybe that wasn't just an insult. Maybe it was a test. Or maybe something else entirely. Brandon scrolled further down the file. Then he paused. There's another note attached to this inquiry, he said. What kind of note? He looked at the screen again before answering. It says Joseph asked one additional question. My stomach tightened. What question? Brandon turned toward me slowly. He asked whether a beneficiary could transfer control of the trust to another person once it was activated. The meaning of that question hit me instantly. Joseph wasn't just curious. He had already been planning what to do with the money. I felt the air leave my lungs. Joseph. The name on the screen didn't look real at first. I stared at it for several seconds, hoping I had misunderstood what Brandon said. But the letters didn't change. Joseph. 2 weeks ago, my stepfather had contacted the bank asking questions about accounts connected to my name. I leaned back slowly in the chair. That can't be right, I said quietly. Brandon turned the monitor slightly toward me again. The record is very clear. I read the line again. Inquiry regarding inactive legacy accounts associated with beneficiary. Requester. Joseph. The room suddenly felt colder than the snowy street outside. I rubbed my hands together slowly. How did he even know something like this existed? I asked. Brandon shook his head slightly. That's difficult to say. He scrolled further through the record. The inquiry itself was fairly cautious. He never mentioned the trust directly. What did he ask exactly? Brandon read from the report. He asked whether any inactive financial accounts connected to your name had recently been activated. I stared at the screen again. Inactive accounts. Legacy accounts. Joseph didn't know the exact structure of the trust, but he suspected there was money somewhere, and he suspected it was connected to me. When did he ask this? I said. 14 days ago. 2 weeks. My mind immediately jumped back to the past month. Little moments that had seemed meaningless at the time suddenly felt very different. Joseph asking whether I had heard anything about my grandmother's estate. Joseph casually mentioning inheritance laws during dinner one night. Joseph asking if I had ever checked any accounts my grandmother might have left behind. I had answered honestly every time. No. Because I truly didn't know. At least, not until last night. I looked up at Brandon. Did the bank tell him anything? No. Nothing. Brandon shook his head. The trust structure is confidential. Without the beneficiary present, we cannot confirm or deny the existence of such accounts. I let out a slow breath. So he didn't know for sure. Correct. But he suspected. That appears to be the case. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet office hummed softly with the distant sound of computers running in the bank. I leaned forward and looked again at the inquiry record. Then another thought struck me. Did my mother know about this? I asked. Brandon considered the question carefully. There is no direct record connecting her to this inquiry. But she called the bank before? Yes. 3 years ago, Rebecca had asked about accounts connected to my name. Now Joseph had asked the same question 2 weeks ago. The pieces were starting to form a pattern. I leaned back in my chair again, staring at the ceiling for a moment. Last night? I said slowly. Joseph suddenly decided it was time for me to leave the house. Brandon watched me silently. He said I needed to learn how to survive on my own. That must have been difficult, Brandon said quietly. I gave a small, humorless laugh. That's one way to describe it. But now the argument at the dinner table looked different in my mind. Less spontaneous. More calculated. Joseph had been watching me closely all evening, pushing the conversation toward my job search, toward my future, toward my independence. And then suddenly he exploded. You can't live here anymore. Go figure it out yourself. I looked back at the screen. What if he thought I already knew about the money? I said slowly. Brandon raised an eyebrow slightly. That's possible. What if he believed I was hiding it? Brandon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked again at the inquiry notes. That might explain why he asked whether control of the trust could be transferred to someone else. My stomach tightened. He asked that. Brandon nodded. Yes. Specifically whether the beneficiary could legally transfer ownership of the assets once the trust became active. The meaning of that question hit me immediately. Joseph had already been thinking about control. Not just whether the money existed, but how to access it. Or take it. I folded my arms tightly across my chest. So 2 weeks ago he started asking questions about money connected to me. Yes. And last night he threw me out of the house. Brandon nodded slowly. That timing does seem notable. Notable. That was a polite way of describing it. I suddenly remembered something Joseph said during the argument. You'll never survive on your own. At the time it felt like an insult. Now it felt like something else. Maybe he thought pushing me out would force me to reveal the truth. Or maybe he thought I would eventually come back desperate. Either way. He clearly believed he had the upper hand. The irony almost made me laugh. Because right now Joseph had no idea what had actually happened this morning. I looked at Brandon again. If Joseph suspected there was money, I said slowly, then why kick me out? Brandon considered that for a moment. Possibly to create pressure. Pressure. If he believed you had access to an inheritance but were not sharing it, forcing independence might have been a way to compel you to reveal it. That made an uncomfortable amount of sense. Joseph had always believed pressure solved problems. Push harder. Demand results. Control the situation. I leaned forward again and looked at the screen. He had started investigating the trust 2 weeks ago. But he never discovered the truth. Because the only way to activate it was exactly what I did this morning. Show up in person with the card. Joseph had been searching for the door. But he never found the key. I slowly leaned back in my chair again. They still think I left the house with nothing, I said quietly. Brandon nodded. That would appear to be the case. I stared at the screen one last time. Joseph's name sat there under the inquiry record. The man who had thrown me out into the snow believing I was powerless. Now the situation had changed completely. But he didn't know it yet. I looked back at Brandon. How much money are we actually talking about here? I asked quietly. Brandon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened another file. A summary page appeared on the screen. And as my eyes moved slowly across the numbers, I felt the ground shift beneath everything I thought I understood about my life. I stared at the numbers on the screen, convinced my eyes had to be wrong. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Several rows of accounts filled the page. Investment portfolios, long-term funds, trust allocations, and beside them, the balances. I swallowed slowly. Is this real? I asked. Brandon watched my reaction carefully. Yes, he said calmly. These are the current totals after market adjustments. I leaned closer to the monitor. The first account alone contained more money than anyone in my family had ever talked about earning in a lifetime. Below it were several others. Different investment structures. Different portfolios. Different holdings. Each with its own balance. When Brandon scrolled to the bottom of the page, a total appeared. The final number sat there quietly on the screen. 7 figures. Closer to 8. My mind went completely blank. That can't be right, I whispered. Brandon folded his hands on the desk. Your grandmother was a very careful investor. I looked at him slowly. She never lived like someone who had this kind of money. That's often the case with people who build long-term wealth, Brandon said. They don't display it. I leaned back in my chair again, trying to breathe normally. My grandmother had lived in the same small house for 30 years. She drove the same car until it stopped working. She clipped coupons from grocery store flyers. Nothing about her life suggested millions of dollars hidden inside a bank trust. How did she even make this kind of money? I asked. Brandon opened another file. This section explains the origins of the fund. The screen filled with older financial records. Investment histories stretching back more than 2 decades. She began investing heavily in infrastructure and energy funds about 25 years ago, Brandon said. That must have required a lot of money to start. It did. I looked up. So where did that money come from? Brandon scrolled again. Then he pointed to a document near the beginning of the record. This is the first deposit. The number beside it made my eyebrows rise. That's a lot. Yes. But where did she get it? Brandon studied the record again. It appears your grandmother sold a company. My head snapped up. A company? Yes. What company? He opened another page. The document contained an old business registration form. I leaned closer to read the name. It was a small engineering consulting firm, the kind that worked on municipal infrastructure projects, bridges, road expansions, public transportation systems. According to the file, my grandmother founded it nearly 30 years ago. She was an engineer. I asked. Brandon nodded. Civil engineering. I stared at the screen in disbelief. I had grown up believing my grandmother had simply worked as an accountant in a small local office. That was the story she always told. But the record said something very different. She built this company herself, Brandon continued, then sold it 15 years later, and invested the profits. Exactly. I leaned back again, trying to absorb the information. My grandmother hadn't just saved money carefully. She had built something, a real business. Then she turned that success into long-term investments. The quiet woman who made soup every Sunday had secretly been a serious investor. And somehow, no one in the family ever talked about it. Why keep all this hidden? I asked. Brandon closed the file slowly. Many people with significant assets prefer privacy, but she hid it from her own family. Brandon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the earlier legal notes again. The trust documentation suggests she had concerns. About my family. Yes. I exhaled slowly. The pieces were becoming clearer. Rebecca had always been obsessed with money. Financial planning. Investment strategies. Control. She built her career around advising other people how to manage their finances. But somehow she never discovered her own mother had quietly built a fortune. Or maybe she suspected something, which would explain the phone call to the bank 3 years ago, and Joseph's inquiry 2 weeks ago. They both sensed something existed, but they never had proof. Until now. I looked again at the screen showing the total balance. Does anyone else know this amount? I asked. No, Brandon replied. The trust is confidential. Only the bank's legal trustees and now you? So Joseph and Rebecca have no idea. That's correct. I felt something strange settle inside my chest. A mix of relief and disbelief. Less than 24 hours ago, I had stood outside in the snow holding a single suitcase. My mother and stepfather had... This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.